A millionaire is cornered by pursuers and is about to be caught when suddenly an old car appears. He panics upon seeing that the driver is a 6-year-old girl shouting for him to get in. With no options left, he obeys. As soon as the door closes, the girl slams the gas and yells, "Hold on tight, they're right behind us." What happens next is so unbelievable it leaves everyone in shock. The smell of burning rubber and damp refuse assailed Arthur's nostrils, a brutal offense to senses accustomed to the aroma of new leather and imported coffee. His heart, an organ he treated with the same cold logic as one of his investment spreadsheets, hammered uncontrollably against his ribs. The fabric of his custom-tailored Italian suit was torn at the shoulder, a wound in the cloth mirroring the chaos that had seized his ordered life. He pressed his back against the cold, rough brick wall of a dead-end alley, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing closer and closer, a trap, so simple, so humiliating. Ricardo, with his predatory smile, had lured him to a fake meeting, a power play that had slipped out of his control for the first time in decades. Every problem, for Arthur, had always had a solution, a price, a lever. But here, in this grimy concrete labyrinth, his fortune was useless, his logic a joke. He was cornered, and fear, an emotion he believed he had outgrown in childhood, suffocated him. Ricardo's men were not subtle, they were instruments of intimidation, and the fear he felt now was exactly what his rival wanted. He closed his eyes for an instant, and the alley's darkness was filled with the image of a small face, blonde hair falling over frightened eyes, his sister, a raw wound from his past, a scar that never healed, throbbing with the same intensity as his current helplessness. He had disappointed her, had failed to protect her, and now, once again, he was weak. The silhouettes of two large men blocked the only exit from the alley. The faint light from a distant streetlight outlined their menacing forms. It was the end of the line. His empire, built on a foundation of absolute control, would crumble because of a miscalculation, an underestimation of another's malice. He flinched, bracing himself for the inevitable, rage bubbling beneath the panic. It was then that a sound ripped through the tense air, the sharp squeal of tires skidding on wet asphalt. An old clunky car with faded paint and a headlight flickering like a tired eye screeched to a halt at the alley's entrance, blocking the view of his pursuers. The engine coughed and sputtered, a pathetic sound that, somehow, sounded like a promise. The passenger window, protesting with a groan, slowly rolled down. Arthur expected to see an unlikely savior, perhaps a kind-hearted local or a lost rideshare driver. But the reality was infinitely more disconcerting. In the driver's seat, barely reaching the steering wheel, was a little girl. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wore a seriousness that did not belong to her age. Her large, dark eyes fixed on him with surprising intensity. "Uncle, get in, quick!" she yelled, her thin, urgent voice cutting through the engine noise. Arthur's brain stalled. It was a hallucination, a delirium brought on by stress. Children didn't drive. But the footsteps behind him grew closer, and the sound anchored him back to the terrifying reality. Between the certainty of violence and the insanity of that scene, the choice was obvious. He ran, stumbling over his own feet, and dove into the passenger seat. The car's interior smelled of oil and something sweetly childlike, like crayons. As soon as the door slammed shut, the girl stretched her leg and stomped on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, and with firm hands on the wheel, she glanced at him for a second, her eyes reflecting panic and determination. The world outside blurred into neon lights and grey concrete. Arthur clung to the dashboard with white knuckles, the cracked synthetic leather groaning under the pressure. Every jolt of the vehicle, every sharp turn the girl made, was a direct affront to his need for control. He was accustomed to professional chauffeurs, to the smooth glide of luxury sedans on planned streets. This was the opposite. It was chaos controlled by a child who could barely see over the steering wheel, perched on what looked like a thick phone book for height. The engine groaned in protest, a raspy sound that seemed to come from the depths of its metallic guts. "How do you know how to drive?" he yelled, his voice more reedy than intended, panic overriding his usual composure. The girl did not take her eyes off the narrow road ahead. Her small hands gripped the wheel with surprising firmness. "My dad taught me the basics before he left," she replied, her voice steady, but with a note of sadness that hung in the air for an instant. The simplicity of the answer disarmed him. His departure, such a soft word for something Arthur suspected had been terribly harsh. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the headlights of his pursuers shrinking, lost at an intersection she had cut across at the last second. She wasn't a skilled driver, but she was unpredictable. No one would expect an old car, driven by a child, to make a prohibited turn down a service alley. They hid for a moment behind a large dumpster, the engine off, the silence filled only by their ragged breaths and the dripping water from a rusty pipe. Arthur had never felt so vulnerable in his entire life. His fate was in the hands of a small orphan. When the sound of the other car faded, she started the engine again. "Where are we going, Uncle?" she asked, looking at him for the first time since the chase began. Her eyes were serious, waiting for an order, a plan. He, the master strategist, was speechless. "To my apartment," he managed to say, giving her the address of his penthouse, a place that until then had represented his power and isolation. 20 minutes later, the noisy, dirty car pulled up in front of the glass and steel skyscraper that was his home. The doorman, accustomed to seeing limousines, looked at the vehicle with a mixture of horror and confusion. Arthur got out, adjusting his torn suit, and opened the door for the girl. She hopped out, small and a little dirty, clutching a keychain with a worn teddy bear. Inside the private elevator, the silence was overwhelming. The contrast between her world and his was stark. The elevator opened directly into his living room, a vast, minimalist space with glass walls that revealed the shimmering city below. It was a cold, impersonal place, devoid of family photos, devoid of memories. A monument to his loneliness. The girl stopped in the center of the room, looking at everything with quiet curiosity. He finally turned to her, the adrenaline giving way to an avalanche of questions. "Why did you do that? Who are you?" he asked, his voice lower now. She met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights. "My name is Lena. I saw your picture in an old newspaper. At the garage, it said you made a donation to the orphanage where I lived." He barely remembered it. A signature on a checker, a tax write-off. "And I heard those men today," she continued, her voice firm. "They were talking about a trap, about getting the rich man in Warehouse Alley. I knew it was you." Arthur's jaw dropped. This child hadn't found him by chance. She had saved him because, in her childish, loyal mind, she felt she owed him something. Before he could process the depth of that gesture, she added the most shocking part. "I heard their name too. The boss is named Ricardo." The name Ricardo hung in the sterile air of the penthouse, a poison contaminating Arthur's sanctuary. The confirmation coming from a child's lips made the betrayal even more bitter and real. Fury, an emotion he usually kept under an iron grip, began to rise in his throat like bile. Ricardo, his partner, the man with whom he had shared profits and strategies for nearly a decade, had orchestrated it all. As he sank into these dark thoughts, Lena walked around the room, her small shoes leaving subtle dust marks on the polished marble floor. She stopped in front of the enormous glass wall, her hands flat against the cold surface, watching the city lights spread out like a carpet of diamonds. To Arthur, that view was a symbol of his power, of his conquest. To her, it seemed to be just beautiful. Arthur's rage, however, soon turned to action. He needed to retaliate, to crush Ricardo before he could cause more damage. He grabbed his smartphone, a device that was an extension of his will, and began dictating orders to his virtual assistant, preparing a legal and financial offensive that would leave Ricardo in ruins. But as he spoke, urgent news flashed across the screen of one of the wall-mounted televisions he kept tuned to business news channels. The headline was a knife in his chest. Arthur Drummond, tech magnate. Fakes own kidnapping in daring stock market manipulation scheme. His photo, taken at a gala event, smiling arrogantly, was next to the sensational headline. His phone began to ring incessantly. Journalists, investors, his board of directors. He silenced the device, the blood draining from his face. Ricardo wasn't just trying to intimidate him, he was destroying his reputation, the very foundation upon which his entire empire was built. His rival was faster, more ruthless than he had imagined. Suddenly, the television screen changed, showing grainy security camera footage. It was the alley, and there he was, running, diving into the old car. And then, a frozen image of Lena's face, magnified and terribly clear, as she looked back for an instant. The anchor's voice was grave and accusatory. Anonymous sources report the child, an accomplice in the charade, was last seen in the industrial area. A substantial reward is being offered for information leading to her whereabouts. Arthur felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. Ricardo wasn't just playing dirty, he was crossing a line. Arthur, even in his coldness, would never dare to cross. He had turned Arthur's savior into a target. The girl who had saved him out of pure loyalty was now in danger because of him. He looked at Lena, who had turned from the glass, her eyes wide with fear as she saw her own face on the television. She was no longer an anonymous hero, she was a fugitive. "Are they looking for me?" she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. Arthur's armor of pragmatism shattered, that fear in her eyes. It was the same fear he had seen in his sister's eyes years ago. The same helplessness flooded him. "We need to get out of here. Now," he said, his voice raw. He grabbed his wallet and the keys to one of his getaway cars, a discreet sedan stored in the underground garage. But when he tried to open the door leading to the service elevator, a red light blinked on the security panel. Access denied. He tried his code, then his fingerprint. Nothing. Ricardo had thought of everything. He was trapped in his own golden fortress. "Is there another way out?" Lena asked, her small hand clutching the fabric of his trousers. The penthouse was no longer a refuge, it was a cage. And across town, greedy, desperate people were now looking for a little girl with a serious face and a messy ponytail. The vulnerability he had felt in the alley returned with full force. For the first time in a long time, Arthur had no plan. He looked out the window, not at the city he dominated, but at the streets below, imagining the eyes that were now hunting them. He needed to get her out of here. But how? His gaze fell on the silenced phone. All his connections, his powerful contacts, they would be useless. Ricardo had poisoned them against him. And then he remembered his money, the solution to everything. He opened his banking app, ready to transfer an exorbitant sum to an offshore account, enough for them to disappear. But a cold, impersonal message appeared on the screen. "Your accounts have been temporarily frozen due to an ongoing investigation." The last pillar of his power crumbled. No reputation, no allies, and now no money. He looked at Lena, who watched him with a trust he didn't deserve. He only had the cash in his wallet, a few $100s. He, the billionaire, and she, the orphan, were alone, hunted, and for the first time in his life, truly poor. The reality of his new condition hit him like a punch to the gut. The rarefied air of his luxury penthouse suddenly felt thick and suffocating. The silence, once a sign of peace and control, was now filled with the hum of the threat closing in around them. Arthur looked at the money in his wallet, $347, an amount he would usually spend on lunch without a second thought. Now, It was all they possessed. Arthur's mind, trained to find logical and efficient solutions, spun in a vacuum. Every door he mentally tried was locked. His contacts, his influence, his buying power, all gone. "The fire escape," Lena said suddenly, her small voice echoing in the vast room. He turned to her. She pointed to a discreet metal door, almost invisible against the grey wall, one he had never used in all the years he had lived there. It was for emergencies, a concept that until then had been purely theoretical to him. The irony was cruel. He, who lived in a world of contingency plans and risk mitigation strategies, needed a child to point him to the most obvious exit. They descended the 50 floors in tense silence, the metal steps echoing under their feet. Each floor they passed was like descending a rung on the social ladder he had climbed with such effort. When they finally reached the ground floor and emerged into a side alley, the damp city air enveloped them. They were anonymous, just two more figures in the night, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. The discreet sedan in the garage was unreachable, but Lena's old clunker was still there, awkwardly parked on the street, a monument to their desperate situation. It was the only refuge they had. They got into the vehicle, and Arthur took the wheel. He drove aimlessly for a while, trying to put distance between them and the glass tower that was no longer his home. The city, which once seemed like a game board under his command, was now a hostile labyrinth. Every approaching headlight in the rearview mirror made him flinch. Every person who looked their way seemed to recognize them. He needed to find a place to hide, a place where no one would think to look for a billionaire and a child. His instincts led him away from the upscale areas to the fringes of the city, where skyscrapers gave way to low-rise buildings and faded neon signs. He spotted the sign of a roadside motel, The Weary Traveler, with a few letters missing. It was perfect in its imperfection. The room was small and smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes. The bedspread had a faded floral pattern, and the television, mounted on a metal bracket on the wall, only picked up 3 channels. Arthur placed the few crumpled bills he had on the worn nightstand. It was a parallel universe, light years away from his reality of Egyptian cotton sheets and 24-hour room service. Lena, on the other hand, seemed almost at ease. She tested the softness of the bed, jumping on it once before looking at him as if asking for permission. He simply nodded, exhausted. The vulnerability was complete. He turned on the small television, and there they were again, their faces on a local news report. Ricardo's story was convincing, an unstable tech genius, capable of anything to keep his stock prices high. Arthur felt stripped, not just of his possessions, but of his very identity. Who was he without his name, his reputation? The dynamic between him and Lena began to change that night. The hierarchy of power, once so clear, dissolved into the dust of that motel room. He, the man who commanded an empire, now didn't even know how to get his next meal without a credit card. He looked at Lena, who had already fallen asleep, curled up under the worn bedspread, the teddy bear keychain clutched in her hand. She, with her instinctive courage and her knowledge of a world he had never inhabited, was now his compass. The night was long. Arthur didn't sleep. He sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching the girl sleep, her breathing soft and regular. The weight of his responsibility was crushing. He had put her in danger. He, who prided himself on protecting his assets, had failed to protect the only person who had shown him disinterested loyalty. That night, the image of his sister, Clara, returned with painful clarity. He remembered the day she left, the small suitcase in her hand, her eyes filled with a sadness he hadn't understood at the time. He was young, arrogant, focused on building his future, and he had neglected her. He had promised himself never to be so helpless again, and he built an empire of money and power as a wall against that feeling. And now, the wall had crumbled, and the same pain, the same guilt haunted him in the silence of a cheap motel room. He realized that the armor he built not only protected him, but also isolated him. He had never asked for help, had never trusted anyone. And now, the only person he could trust was a 6-year-old child, sleeping a few feet away, dreaming of a world that he, with all his power, had made dangerous for her. The grey light of morning seeped through the crack in the tattered curtain, bringing with it the harsh reality of a new day in hiding. Arthur hadn't moved from the plastic chair, his muscles stiff and sore, his mind heavy with lack of sleep and excessive worries. The aroma of weak coffee and grease from a nearby diner mingled with the stagnant smell of the room. It was the smell of survival, a concept he'd only known from history books and economic reports until then. Lena woke slowly, rubbing her eyes with her small fists. She sat up in bed, her dark hair all tangled, and looked at him with a clear, awake expression, as if living in a roadside motel were the most natural thing in the world. "I'm hungry," she announced, not as a complaint, but as a fact. The simplicity of her need struck him. Hunger, a problem he had always solved with a phone call, an app, a gesture. Now, it was a logistical challenge. With the money remaining, they needed to be frugal. Every dollar counted. "We'll find something to eat," he said, trying to inject a confidence he didn't feel into his voice. They left the room, and the morning sun hit them, strong and merciless. The world seemed dangerously normal. Cars passed on the highway. People went in and out of the diner, living their lives, oblivious to the drama unfolding for the fugitive billionaire and his little protector. It was Lena who took the lead. "We can't go there," she said, pointing to the diner. "There's a TV inside, and too many people." She was right. His face, and hers, could be recognized at any moment. Instead, she guided him down a side street, towards a small neighborhood market. "This is better," she whispered. "No one pays much attention." Her street smarts were something Arthur could never have bought. She navigated that world of anonymity and danger with an instinctive ease. Inside the market, she picked out bread, cheese, and a juice box, calculating prices with a seriousness that impressed him. He, the man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, watched a 6-year-old ensure they didn't spend more than necessary. They ate sitting on a dusty bench behind the motel, hidden from view of the road. The food was simple, but for Arthur, hungry and exhausted, it felt like a feast. As they ate in silence, he realized how dependent on her he had become. He was the adult, the supposed protector, but it was her wisdom, born of hardship, that kept them safe. Despair began to gnaw at him. He needed help, an ally. He thought of his lawyer, Marcus, a man who had served him for 15 years, whose loyalty he believed to be unshakable, forged in corporate battles and confidential agreements. They found a payphone, an artifact from a bygone era, on a forgotten street corner. Arthur inserted the coins with trembling hands. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Marcus speaking, the familiar voice sounded on the line. "Marcus, it's me, Arthur," he said, his voice low and urgent. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that seemed too long. "Arthur, where are you? The whole city is after you." "I know, Marcus, it was a trap. Ricardo set the whole thing up. I need you. I need the shareholder agreement documents, the moral conduct clause. With that, I can prove he's violating our contract. I can initiate action with the board." Marcus's voice on the other end grew cold, distant. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Arthur." "What do you mean, not possible?" Arthur retorted, panic beginning to rise. "Those documents, they seem to have been misplaced. And frankly, Arthur, given the circumstances, the board is already moving to oust you. Representing you now would be professional suicide." The betrayal was a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just cowering, he was abandoning him. Worse, the mention of misplaced documents was too specific. Ricardo had gotten to him. He had bought him off. The last bridge to his old world had been burned. "You let him do this, Marcus. You gave everything away, Arthur whispered into the phone, understanding chilling him to the bone. Business is business, Arthur. You always said that, Marcus replied, and the line went dead. Arthur stood there, phone in hand, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. He was completely alone. His lawyer's betrayal isolated him in a way even Ricardo's pursuit hadn't managed. He turned and saw Lena watching him, her big eyes full of silent understanding. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She saw it on his face. He sat down on the curb, head in his hands. The armor of self-sufficiency he had worn his entire life was in pieces. He had no one left. No one but that small figure who approached him and, hesitantly, placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was so simple, so pure, that it broke something inside him. The helplessness he so feared wasn't about losing money or power. It was about this, about being utterly alone and cornered, with no one to turn to. That touch, however, said otherwise. He wasn't entirely alone, and in that moment he realized the small hand on his shoulder was the only real thing he had left. The days that followed merged into a grey routine of vigilance and scarcity. The weary traveler motel became their small fortress, a precarious refuge from the outside world. They only left when necessary, moving in the shadows of dawn and dusk like nocturnal creatures. Arthur, the man who once commanded boardrooms with his imposing presence, now learned from Lena the art of invisibility. He traded his torn suit for cheap clothes from a second-hand store, a disguise that wounded his pride but ensured his safety. Lena taught him to walk with his head down, to avoid eye contact, to blend into the urban landscape in a way he never imagined possible. The suffering, however, was not just external. The lack of control, the constant anxiety, and the humiliation of his situation corroded Arthur from within. Nights were the worst. He lay awake for hours, replaying his mistakes, Ricardo's betrayal, Marcus's cowardice, and above all, the image of Lena, whose childhood was being stolen because of him. During the day, to pass the time and keep the girl's mind occupied, he tried to teach her things. He started with math, drawing equations on paper napkins, but she seemed more interested in his stories about technology, about how computers worked and how he built his company from nothing. In those moments, a glimpse of the old Arthur appeared, passionate and articulate, but reality always brought them back to the grim present, and then the suffering took a crueler, more tangible form. On a cold, damp morning, Lena woke up with a flushed face and a dry cough that echoed painfully in the small room. Arthur touched her forehead and felt the feverish heat. Panic, a feeling he was becoming all too familiar with, gripped him with icy claws. In his old world, a fever would be handled with a call to his private doctor, who would appear at his penthouse in less than an hour. Here, with money quickly running out, a hospital was out of the question. They would be identified immediately. He watched her sleep, her breathing short and labored, and the same wave of helplessness he had felt when he lost his sister drowned him. He remembered Clara, sick in bed, and his parents, worried about bills, hesitating to call a doctor. He was just a teenager then, weak and unable to help. He swore to himself that he would never again be limited by lack of resources, that his money would be a shield to protect those he loved. And now, with all his supposed power, he was in the exact same position, watching someone he cared about suffer, his hands tied. Lena's fever worsened throughout the day. She was too weak to eat, her large, usually bright eyes glazed and feverish. Arthur knew he couldn't wait any longer. He counted the crumpled bills that remained. $48. He left the motel, his heart pounding against his ribs, and walked to the nearest pharmacy. The place was bright and sterile, a stark contrast to his situation. He felt like an imposter, a criminal. He described Lena's symptoms to the pharmacist, an older man with tired eyes who gave him children's fever medicine and cough syrup. The total came to almost $20. He paid, hoarding the change as if it were treasure. That night, He cared for her with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. He measured the medicine dose carefully, held a glass of water for her to drink, and wiped her warm forehead with a damp cloth. She was half asleep, murmuring nonsense. In a moment of delirium, she held his hand. "Dad," she whispered, her voice weak. The word hit him with the force of a wave. He didn't correct her. He just stayed there, holding her small hand. The weight of that unearned title crushing him, sitting on the edge of the bed, in the silence of the night, broken only by Lena's soft cough. The dam he had built around his emotions finally broke. Tears, hot and bitter, streamed down his face for the first time in over 20 years. He didn't cry for the loss of his fortune or his status. He cried for his failure, for the repetition of his history. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he whispered into the darkness. The words directed at his sister, but meant for the girl sleeping in the bed. "I won't lose you too." He confessed his fears to the four walls of that cheap room, his guilt, his arrogance. He admitted to himself that his pursuit of power wasn't about success, but about fear. Fear of being weak, of being helpless, of failing the people who depended on him. It was the first time he allowed himself to be truly vulnerable, not forced by the situation, but by choice. And in that silent confession, something shifted. A fragile, precious connection of trust, which until then had only been implicit, solidified between him and the sleeping child. He was no longer just a man she had saved, and she was no longer just a girl he needed to protect. They were, in some inexplicable way, a family forged in the fire of adversity. He continued to hold her hand until the sun rose, feeling the fever finally begin to break. The storm had passed, but the landscape of his soul was forever altered. Lena recovered with the remarkable resilience of childhood. The fever broke, and in 2 days, the color returned to her face. The cough persisted, but it was weaker, less alarming. The small crisis, however, had changed everything. The bond between them, once an alliance of necessity, deepened into something closer to genuine care. Arthur found himself watching her draw on a piece of cardboard with a chalk shard they found on the street, and felt a protective warmth in his chest that scared and comforted him at the same time. He, who had never considered himself capable of caring for anyone, had passed the most terrifying test of his life. But her recovery also brought back the urgency of their situation. Money was almost gone. They couldn't stay in that motel forever. The feeling of being in a dead end returned to oppress him. One afternoon, as he looked out the window, watching the anonymous flow of cars on the highway, despair struck him again. "We have nowhere to go," he muttered to himself, more to himself than to Lena. Lena, who was sitting on the floor arranging a small collection of smooth stones, looked up. She watched him for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw the defeat in his shoulders, the same helplessness he had felt while caring for her. She stood up and walked to the dresser where he had thrown the old car keys. She picked up the keychain with the little bear and gently jingled it. The sound of the keys clinking seemed to awaken something in her. "My dad," she said, her voice low and thoughtful. "He always used to say something funny." Arthur turned, paying attention. Any distraction was welcome. He used to say, "Lena, the answers to big problems aren't in the engines, but in the papers kept in the toolbox." Arthur stared at her, confused. It sounded like the kind of enigmatic saying a simple man would utter. It probably referred to manuals, warranties. "What papers?" he asked, and without much interest. "I don't know. He just said that. His box is in the trunk." A spark of curiosity, faint but present, ignited in Arthur. It was a shot in the dark, a foolish hope, but it was more than they had. They waited for nightfall. Under the cloak of darkness, they furtively made their way to the car. The air was cold, and with each passing car, Arthur felt a chill of fear. He opened the trunk, which groaned in protest. Inside, in a corner, was a large, red, rusty metal toolbox. It was heavy, They carried it to the room, locking the door behind them. They placed it on the floor and opened it. The smell of grease and metal filled the air. The first tray contained screwdrivers, pliers, and other tools Arthur could barely name. Everything was greasy, well used. He felt foolish. He was looking for salvation amidst the disarray of a deceased mechanic. But Lena didn't lose heart. "There has to be a false bottom," she said, with the certainty of someone who knew her father's secrets. She began to remove the tools, one by one. Beneath the main tray, there were more heavy tools, but when they removed the last wrench, they saw that the metal bottom of the box seemed loose in one corner. Arthur used the tip of a screwdriver to pry up the metal plate. It lifted, revealing a shallow, secret compartment. And there, wrapped in an oily rag to protect it from moisture, was a small, worn, leather-bound ledger with an elastic band to keep it closed. Arthur's heart began to beat faster. He picked up the book. The pages were filled with tight, precise handwriting. They were service records, dates, license plates, job descriptions. Most seemed normal: oil changes, brake repairs. But some entries were marked with a small asterisk and contained coded notes. Compartment modification, NV78X, night delivery, secondary tracker installation, chassis YP44T, client R, client R. Arthur's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages feverishly, his analyst's brain working at full speed. The dates, the codes, a pattern began to emerge. These were unofficial services for suspicious figures. And then he saw it, an entry from 6 months ago. The name was written out in full, as if Lena's father wanted to make sure he wouldn't forget. Ricardo Vargas, full modification on 3 black sedans. Cash payment, urgent. Ricardo. The proof. A proof that Ricardo was involved in activities far beyond corporate trickery. Lena's father wasn't just a mechanic, he was a specialist, forced by circumstances Arthur could only imagine to work for dangerous people. Arthur's innocence and Ricardo's guilt were there in those pages. They had the weapon they needed. As Arthur stared at the ledger, a mixture of triumph and fear growing within him, he heard a sound outside. The crunch of gravel under tires. He rushed to the window and peeked through the curtain. A black sedan, identical to those he'd seen on the news pursuing them, screeched to a halt in front of their motel room door. The car's lights went out, but not before its headlights illuminated the room for an instant, revealing their silhouettes to whoever was inside. They had been found. Panic was instant and overwhelming. Arthur recoiled from the window, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. The ledger in his hand seemed to weigh a ton, a precious artifact and, at the same time, a death sentence. The doors of the black sedan opened outside, and he heard the grave voices of 2 men. They weren't trying to be discreet. They knew their targets were there. "There's no way out," Arthur whispered, desperation seizing his voice. He looked around the small room, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The door, the window, both led directly to Ricardo's men. Lena, however, didn't seem paralyzed by fear. Her eyes darted around the room, assessing the situation with a clarity Arthur couldn't summon. She ran to the small bathroom window, which overlooked the back of the motel. It was tiny, too high for him, but maybe for her. "I can fit," she said, her voice firm, without a trace of hesitation. "I'll run and get help." "No!" The word burst from Arthur's mouth with a force that surprised him. The idea of separating from her, of sending her alone into the darkness, was unbearable. It was a repetition of his greatest failure, leaving someone he should protect to face danger alone. The image of his sister, Clara, walking away haunted him. "I won't let you go." In that moment, he realized his priority had changed. It was no longer about clearing his name or recovering his fortune. It was about protecting that girl. The sound of a heavy knock on the door made both of them jump. "Open up, Drummond! We know you're in there! Make it easy on yourselves!" The voice was rough, impatient. Arthur shoved the ledger inside his jacket, the zipper scratching his skin. He pushed the heavy wooden dresser against the door, a flimsy barricade that wouldn't buy them much time. Another knock. Harder this time, rattled the door in its frame. "Think, Arthur, think," he muttered to himself, his logical mind battling the surge of adrenaline. That's when his gaze fell on the old car, parked just a few feet from the front window. The car that had saved them once. Could it save them again? A crazy, desperate plan began to form in his mind. It was risky, almost suicidal, but it was their only chance. He turned to Lena. "I need you to trust me." Completely. She looked into his eyes, and instead of fear he saw determination. She nodded. The door shuddered with a powerful kick. The wood began to crack. "When I say now, I want you to hide under the bed and don't come out for anything. Understand?" he instructed, his voice low and urgent. "No matter what happens." "But what about you?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I'm going to distract them. Just do what I say." The door took another violent blow, and the lock splintered with a metallic crack. Arthur grabbed the plastic chair, the only weapon he had. "Now, Lena, go!" She hesitated for a second and then dove under the bed, disappearing beneath the floral comforter. The next instant, the door burst open with a crash. Two huge men entered the room, their eyes sweeping the cramped space. They saw Arthur standing, the chair raised like a pathetic shield. Their expressions were a mix of contempt and irritation. "Ma, where's the girl?" asked the first, the taller of the two. "She's gone," Arthur replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "She ran out the bathroom window 10 minutes ago." The second man checked the bathroom, cursing when he saw the small window open. It was a plausible lie. Their attention was focused on Arthur, exactly as he wanted. As the first man advanced, Arthur threw the chair at his legs, causing him to stumble. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Arthur ran to the window, shattered the glass with his jacket-wrapped elbow, and leaped out. He landed with a thud on the asphalt, pain shooting up his ankle. Ignoring the pain, he ran to the old car. He knew he didn't have the keys, but Lena's father was a mechanic, a man who probably knew all the tricks. Arthur had spent hours in the car, waiting, thinking, and he had noticed something, a loose wire under the dashboard. It was a gamble. He squeezed into the driver's seat, found the wires, and joined them. The engine coughed, protested, but then miraculously caught. With a roar, he slammed it into gear and floored the accelerator. The men, recovering from their surprise, rushed out of the room, guns drawn. Arthur didn't drive away. He spun the wheel hard, making the car fishtail. He wasn't fleeing. He was attacking. He sped directly toward the black sedan which was blocking the exit. The impact was deafening. Metal twisted, glass shattered. The sedan's alarm blared, a piercing shriek in the night. The old clunker, built like a tank, had disabled the newer vehicle, completely blocking the motel parking lot exit. The men fired, but Arthur was already scrambling out of the wrecked car and running, limping, into the darkness behind the motel. He had created a distraction, a noisy chaos that would surely attract attention. But in doing so, he had separated himself from Lena. He hid behind a dumpster, his heart in his throat, watching the motel lights. He could hear sirens approaching in the distance. His plan had worked, but at what cost? He was hurt, exposed, and Lena was alone in the room, with the door broken down and two furious men nearby. The helplessness he had fought so hard to avoid enveloped him again, colder and darker than ever. The darkness behind the dumpster was a cold ally. Arthur pressed his body against the icy metal, trying to control his ragged breathing, each inhale a stab in his aching ribs. His ankle throbbed with sharp pain, but it was the pain in his chest, a mix of fear and guilt that consumed him. The sirens grew louder, a rising wail that promised order, but to him meant only more danger. He couldn't trust the police. Ricardo would surely have contacts there too. His mind, however, wasn't on his own safety. It was stuck in that motel room, with Lena hidden under the bed. He had left her behind. The logic of his plan, to create a distraction, immobilize the pursuers, attract unwanted attention to them, now seemed monumentally stupid. He had abandoned her, just as he felt he had abandoned Clara. Guilt was a poison, paralyzing him. What would he do if something happened to her? How could he live with himself? Ricardo's men couldn't have gone far. He imagined them, furious and frustrated, perhaps still searching for him around the motel, or worse, returning to the room to make sure the girl really wasn't there. He needed to go back. He needed to be sure she was safe. Ignoring the searing pain in his ankle, he moved, limping from shadow to shadow, circling the motel building to approach from a different angle. The flashing lights of police cars now illuminated the scene with blue and red flashes, creating a chaotic shadow play. He saw the officers approaching the two henchmen, who now stood with their hands up, trying to explain their presence and the collision. The distraction had worked better than he expected. Taking advantage of the confusion, Arthur dragged himself to the back of the motel, reaching the broken window of the room. His heart was in his throat. He peered over the sill. The room was empty. The bed was messy, the comforter tossed aside. Lena wasn't there. An icy terror coursed through him, more intense than anything he had ever felt. He had failed. They had taken her. He was about to scream, to give himself up, to do anything, when he heard a small sound from below, almost inaudible amid the wail of sirens. "Uncle Arthur!" The voice was a whisper. He looked down and saw her. Lena was huddled in the bushes growing against the motel wall, small and almost invisible in the darkness. The relief was so intense that his legs gave out, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. She was safe. She was safe. How? He managed to whisper back, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I heard the crash," she explained, crawling out of the bushes and approaching him. "When they ran out after you, I slipped out the door and hid here. You told me not to come out from under the bed. But my dad also said plans change." Her practicality, her calm amidst the chaos, was a miracle. She hadn't just blindly followed his orders. She had thought, adapted, and survived. She was stronger than he had ever imagined. In that moment, their relationship deepened once more. He wasn't just her protector. They were partners, equals in a war they hadn't chosen. "You're hurt," she said, looking at his ankle, where his pant leg was torn and stained with blood. "We need to get out of here before the police start searching around." She was right. The crime scene would soon expand. They needed to disappear. Leaning on her would be impossible, so he leaned on the wall, using it as a crutch, as he limped away from the motel into the dark, silent streets of the adjacent industrial neighborhood. Every step was agony. The adrenaline that had kept him moving was fading, replaced by throbbing pain and profound exhaustion. Lena walked beside him, her small hand occasionally touching his arm, as if to give him strength. They hid in a junkyard, the air heavy with the smell of rust and oil. They found shelter inside the carcass of an abandoned school bus. The place was cold and uncomfortable, but it was safe for now. They sat on the metal floor, the silence broken only by the distant wail of sirens. Arthur pulled the ledger from inside his jacket. It was safe. He looked at Lena, whose face was smudged with dirt, but whose eyes shone in the gloom. "You were very brave," he said, his voice filled with an admiration he rarely felt for anyone. She shrugged, a small, humble gesture. "You too." In that rusty bus, surrounded by the wreckage of the past, they shared a moment of quiet. The chase had broken them physically, but it had forged them into something new. The trust between them was now unshakable, tested by fire. Arthur knew he couldn't keep running aimlessly anymore. They had the proof, but it was useless if they couldn't deliver it to someone who could use it. His lawyer had betrayed him. The police weren't trustworthy. He needed someone from the outside, someone with the power to expose the truth, but with no loyalty to Ricardo. And then a name came to mind. An investigative journalist, the same one he had publicly humiliated a year ago for questioning his business practices. Helena Vargas, famous for her tenacity and incorruptibility. She hated him, but she hated corruption even more. It would be his last card, the riskiest gamble of all. He would have to contact her, convince her that he wasn't the villain she thought he was. He would have to trust an enemy to save their lives. The junkyard became their sanctuary and their prison. At dawn, the reality of their situation asserted itself with the harshness of the cold metal around them. Arthur's ankle was swollen and bruised, the pain a constant throbbing presence. Moving was torture. They were trapped, without food, with water from a rusty faucet they found as their only source of sustenance. The most dangerous thing, however, was the feeling of isolation. The world outside continued, driven by Ricardo's lies. They were hunted, and every passing hour increased the risk of being discovered. The idea of contacting Helena Vargas, the journalist, solidified in Arthur's mind, transforming from a desperate gamble into the only viable option. He remembered her face, the intelligent, incisive eyes that had analyzed him during the interview that had turned into a confrontation. He had dismissed her as an annoying idealist, someone who didn't understand the complexities of the business world. Now, that very idealism was his only hope. "I need to make a call," he told Lena, who was trying to clean her face with a handkerchief she had found in the bus. "But I can't leave here. They might be searching everywhere." Lena's eyes scanned the labyrinth of stacked metal. She was small and agile. She could move through there unseen. "I can go," she offered, without hesitation. Arthur's protective instinct screamed in protest. Sending her out into the world alone, even for a short distance, felt like a betrayal of his promise to protect her. But the pain in his ankle was a cruel reminder of his incapacitation. He was stuck. He depended on her once again. The internal struggle was brief but intense. His old self-sufficiency fought against the new reality of their interdependence. Finally, he gave in. "There's a payphone about 4 blocks from here, near a convenience store. Can you remember the way?" he asked. She nodded. "I pay attention to things." He took a crumpled piece of paper and wrote Helena's name and number. He handed her the few coins he had left. "Tell her Arthur Drummond needs to speak with her. Tell her it's about Ricardo and that it's urgent. Tell her to call me at this number." He pointed to the payphone number, etched into the metal. "Memorize this number, Lena. Don't write it down." She repeated the digits twice, her brow furrowed in concentration, until they were imprinted in her memory. "Be careful," he said, his voice choked. "Don't talk to anyone else. If you feel anything is wrong, come straight back." She looked at him with her serious eyes. "I'll be fine." And then she was gone, slipping between the car carcasses like a small ghost. Arthur was left alone in the bus, the silence amplifying his fears. Every minute that passed was an eternity. He imagined all the dangers she might encounter. What if someone recognized her? The reward was still active. What if she got lost? He dragged himself to the broken window of the bus, from where he could see a stretch of the street. He waited, the ledger pressed against his chest, his only bargaining chip. Time dragged on. He began to doubt his decision. He should have risked it, limping to the phone himself. His dependence on her shamed and terrified him. Their relationship had deepened beyond anything he had ever known. The worry he felt wasn't that of a responsible guardian. It was the visceral fear of losing the only person who mattered in his crumbling world. She was no longer a stranger, an orphan who had saved him. She was Lena, and the possibility of losing her was more terrifying than Ricardo's pursuit or the loss of his empire. After what felt like a lifetime, he saw her, a small figure darting back, moving with the same stealthy agility as before. She slipped into the bus, breathing a little hard, but her eyes bright with success. "I talked to her assistant," she said, catching her breath. "She said Ms. Vargas is in a meeting, but she'll see the message. I left the number." Arthur felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. You were incredible, Lena. Absolutely incredible. Now, all they could do was wait. Wait and hope that Helena Vargas, the woman he had scorned, was curious enough or principled enough to return the call. They sat in silence, the tension mounting with each passing minute. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple through the dirty bus window. The sharp, jarring ring of a phone broke the silence of the junkyard. The sound came from the direction of the payphone. It was her. Helena Vargas was calling back, but the question now was different. How would he, a man who could barely walk, get there to answer the call that could save their lives? The phone's ringing was a beacon of hope and an alarm of panic, all at once. Each ring echoed through the junkyard, a shrill, insistent sound that seemed too loud, too dangerous. Arthur knew he had only a few minutes before the call went to voicemail or Helena simply gave up. "I have to go," he said, more to himself than to Lena. He tried to stand, using the side of the bus as support. The pain in his ankle exploded, a blinding white agony that made him gasp and slump back into the seat. Frustration flooded him. To be so close, yet physically unable to reach his salvation, was a new form of torture. "You can't walk," Lena stated, concern etched on her face. She looked in the direction of the sound, then back at him. "I'll go," she said, the decision made in an instant. "I'll tell her to wait. Then I'll come back to help you get there." "No, Lena," he protested, but her determination was unshakable. "It's the only way." She was already moving, slipping out of the bus before he could argue further. He watched her run, a small blur of motion against the deepening shadows of dusk. Alone again, Arthur was consumed by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He, the titan of industry, the master of the digital universe, was reduced to waiting, depending on a child's courage to fight his battles. As he waited, the relationship between them crystallized in his mind. He realized that the connection he felt for Lena was not just gratitude or responsibility. It was something deeper, something he dared not name, but which filled the void he had carried in his heart for years. She had forced him to feel again, to care. She had rescued him from a much older, darker prison than Ricardo's pursuit, the prison of his own coldness. He saw Lena return, running as fast as her small legs would carry her. "She'll wait," she panted, reaching his side. But she sounded mad. Arthur almost smiled. That sounded like the Helena Vargas he knew. "Now, let's go," Lena said, taking charge. She looked around and her gaze fell on a rusty wheel axle, a long piece of metal. "Use this as a crutch." With her help, Arthur managed to stand. Leaning on the metal axle, he began the slow, agonizing journey toward the payphone. Each step was a monumental effort. Lena stayed by his side, a silent, steady support, her small body ready to brace him if he faltered. They moved as a single unit, her strength compensating for his weakness. They reached the phone just as it began to ring again. Helena was, if nothing else, persistent. Arthur grabbed the receiver, his hand trembling with pain and anxiety. "Hello," he said, his voice raw. "Drummond?" Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, cutting, skeptical, and razor-edged. "You have 60 seconds to convince me this isn't a waste of my time or a trap." "Vargas," he gasped, trying to catch his breath. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm offering you the story of a lifetime. Spare me the melodrama. The story circulating is that you're a desperate market manipulator. Why should I believe anything different?" Her distrust was an icy wall. "Because I have proof," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "Proof that links Ricardo Vargas to a smuggling ring. He framed me to cover up his own crimes. I have a ledger, names, dates, license plates." There was silence on the other end of the line. Arthur could picture her, eyes narrowed, her analytical mind processing the information. The mention of concrete proof was the bait he knew she couldn't ignore. "Where are you?" she finally asked, her tone still cautious. "I can't say over the phone. It's too risky. I need to meet you. Alone." "You're asking a lot, Drummond. You're a fugitive." "I'm a victim," he corrected her. "And there's a child with me." Ricardo turned her into a target. "Her life is in danger because of me." The mention of Lena seemed to shift the tone of the conversation. There was another pause, longer this time. "All right," Helena said, her voice now tinged with professional reluctance. "The abandoned junkyard on West Street. Tomorrow at noon. Come alone. If I see anything suspicious, I'll vanish and hand your location over to the police. Understood?" "Understood," Arthur replied, relief making him feel weak. He hung up the phone and leaned against the booth, exhausted, but with a glimmer of hope. They had a chance to expose the truth and end this nightmare. He looked at Lena, who watched him with anxious eyes. He bent down, ignoring the pain, and hugged her. It was an awkward, unpracticed gesture, but loaded with all the emotion he had suppressed. "Thank you, Lena," he whispered into her hair. "We're going to make it. Because of you, we're going to make it." She hugged him back, her small arms wrapping around his neck. In that embrace, amidst the dirt and despair, Arthur felt a clarity that money could never buy. Victory over Ricardo wouldn't just be about justice or revenge. It would be about securing a safe future for the girl who had taught him to be human again. But as they limped back to the shelter of the bus, a shadow detached itself from a building across the street. A figure who had been watching the phone booth, a man who had heard enough to know where and when the exchange of information would take place. Arthur's gamble had been accepted, but the game was about to become much more dangerous. Noon at the junkyard was oppressive. The sun beat down mercilessly on the mountains of twisted metal, turning the place into a furnace. The air smelled of rust and dust. Arthur and Lena were hidden inside the carcass of an abandoned van, watching the entrance. Arthur's ankle was a throbbing mass of pain, but his mind was extraordinarily clear. His entire future, and Lena's, depended on the next few minutes. Punctually, a discreet, unassuming car pulled up at the entrance. Helena Vargas stepped out. She was exactly as he remembered, dressed with elegant practicality, her hair pulled back in a tight bun and a gaze that missed nothing. She stood near her car, arms crossed, waiting, leaving Lena hidden. Arthur limped out, using the metal axle as support. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The distrust on Helena's face was visible from yards away. "You came," Arthur said, his voice dry. "I'm a journalist, Drummond. The possibility of a good story outweighs my disdain for you. Barely outweighs it, but it does," she replied, without mincing words. "Show me what you've got." He approached and with trembling hands handed her Lena's father's ledger. She took it with hesitation, as if it might be contaminated. She began to flip through the pages, her skeptical expression slowly giving way to intense concentration. Her eyes moved quickly, absorbing the notes, the dates, the license plates. She stopped on the page with Ricardo's name, her eyebrow arched. "This is substantial, if authentic," she admitted, her voice low. "It's authentic," Arthur assured her. "The girl who's with me, she's the daughter of the man who wrote this." At that very moment, the sound of engines broke the heavy silence. Not one, but 3 black sedans appeared, blocking the only exit from the junkyard with rehearsed precision. Arthur's heart plummeted. It was a trap. The figure he most feared emerged from the middle car. Ricardo. He wore an impeccable suit, his hair perfectly combed, a smug smile on his face. "Arthur, Arthur," he said, clapping slowly. "Did you really think it would be that easy? Handing my private ledger to the press?" Helena quickly hid the book in her bag, her face a mask of fury and professionalism. "You followed me," she stated, her voice icy. "Of course, I did," Ricardo said, approaching. His men got out of the other cars, surrounding them. "I knew Arthur's desperation would lead him to an extreme measure like contacting you, and you, predictably, couldn't resist the bait." Ricardo looked at Arthur with contempt. "It's over, my old friend. Give me the book, and maybe I'll let the journalist go with a story about how you had a mental breakdown." Arthur's instinct screamed at him to fight, but he could barely stand. He looked in the direction of the van, praying Lena remained hidden. "Run!" he yelled at Helena. "Get out of here!" But there was nowhere to run. It was then that, from the hidden van, came a sound. The horn of Lena's old clunker, which they had managed to push inside the night before. The sound, loud and discordant, surprised everyone for a second. It was Lena's signal, the distraction he needed. "Get in your car!" Arthur yelled at Helena, shoving her toward her vehicle. He, in turn, ignoring the pain, ran and threw himself into the driver's seat of the old clunker. He had spent the night studying Lena's father's notes. There was one about the car. Reinforced chassis in the front. The engine's weight makes it unstable on tight turns. But a beast in a straight line. He started it up. The engine roared to life. Ricardo's men, recovering from the shock, began to move. Arthur stomped on the accelerator. The old car shot forward, not towards the blocked exit, but towards a massive pile of metal carcasses. Helena, understanding the plan in a fraction of a second, started her car. Ricardo's men were confused, divided between the two vehicles. At the last second, Arthur spun the wheel with all his strength. As the book said, the rear of the car skidded violently. He used the momentum, turning the car into a spinning battering ram. The reinforced front of the car slammed into the side of the first black sedan with a devastating impact. The second car, trying to swerve, collided with a scrap pile. The risky maneuver had worked. He had created an opening. "Now, Helena, go!" he yelled. Her car screeched its tires and shot through the gap he'd created, tearing past the wreckage and hitting the street. She and the proof were safe. Arthur tried to reverse, but the old car's engine died with a final wheeze. He was trapped, surrounded by Ricardo and his furious men, who were now advancing on foot. Police sirens, likely called by Helena, began to wail in the distance, but to Arthur they seemed a world away. The silence that followed the chaos was deafening. The dead engine, the echo of distant sirens, the heavy breathing of the approaching men. Arthur sat in the driver's seat of the wrecked car, his body aching, his ankles screaming in protest. But, for the first time in 2 weeks, he didn't feel fear. He felt a strange calm. He looked at Ricardo, who approached with his face contorted into a mask of fury. The facade of control and superiority had shattered, revealing the desperate man beneath. "You cost me everything," Ricardo hissed, stopping beside the car's open door. His men formed a menacing semicircle. "You might have sent the journalist away, but the book is gone with her." "It's over, Ricardo," Arthur said, his voice firm and tired. Ricardo laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You still don't get it, do you? Power isn't in the proof. It's in who controls the narrative. I'm going to crush this story, and I'll crush you." He signaled to his men. "Get him!" As they advanced, a small figure emerged from behind a stack of tires. "Stop!" Lena yelled, her voice thin, but carrying surprising authority. Everyone froze, turning to look at the child confronting them. She held a smartphone in her hand, Arthur's device, which he had left behind in the van. The screen was on, recording. "It's all live," she announced, her voice trembling slightly but firm. To the police, they tracked the signal. They heard everything. It was a bluff, a magnificent, desperate bluff. But in Ricardo's high-tech world, it was an entirely believable bluff. Doubt flickered in the eyes of his men. They exchanged nervous glances. Confronting a billionaire was one thing. Being caught on a live broadcast threatening a child and an injured man was another. The sirens were much closer now, the sound filling the junkyard. Ricardo looked from Lena to Arthur, and then in the direction of the sirens. The calculation in his eyes was visible. The window of opportunity was closing. He cursed, a low, vicious sound, and turned. "Let's go!" His men, relieved, backed away and scrambled into the only car that still worked. They drove off in a cloud of dust and frustration. The moment they disappeared, the first police cars arrived, lights flashing, flooding the scene. Arthur finally allowed himself to relax. The adrenaline abandoned him, and deep exhaustion washed over him. Lena ran to his side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes wide and worried. He managed to smile. "Thanks to you." The story exploded. With the evidence from the ledger and Helena's recording, which, anticipating trouble, she had secretly activated on her own phone, the truth came to light. Ricardo's smuggling ring was dismantled. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized. The media, once so quick to condemn Arthur, now painted him as a tragic hero. His name was cleared, his reputation, though scarred by the ordeal, was restored. His fortune was released. The nightmare was over. In the days that followed, Arthur was subjected to a whirlwind of interrogations, meetings with lawyers, and medical examinations. He found himself back in his world of luxury and power, but something fundamental had changed within him. The luxury penthouse seemed empty and cold. The city view no longer brought him a sense of dominance, but of loneliness. Throughout this time, Lena remained under the care of social services, a standard procedure. The separation was difficult for both of them. He visited her every day, and with each visit, the silence and the space between them seemed larger, more unnatural. He was back on his pedestal, and she, back in the system he had once tried to help with an anonymous donation. One night, in his silent penthouse, Arthur found himself looking at the enormous glass wall. He saw not the city lights, but the reflection of a lonely man. He had everything back, the money, the power, the name, but he felt poorer than ever. The pain of helplessness he so feared had not been cured by the restoration of his fortune. The true healing had begun the moment he held Lena's feverish hand, the instant he trusted her in the junkyard, the warmth of her embrace. He realized that the armor he had built didn't protect him from suffering. It isolated him from joy. The human connection he had found with Lena was more valuable than his entire empire. He made a decision. It wasn't a business decision based on logic or profit. It was a decision from the heart, an organ he was finally learning to listen to. He picked up the phone and made a call to his new lawyer, a man of integrity recommended by Helena. "I want to begin proceedings," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "I want to adopt a child. Her name is Lena." The journey of suffering and persecution had ended, but the journey of overcoming and healing was just beginning. He wasn't just clearing his name, he was rewriting his life. 6 months later, the smell of grease and polished metal replaced the sterile aroma of filtered air conditioning in Arthur's life. The downtown penthouse was sold. He now spent most of his days in a much noisier, dirtier, and infinitely more alive place, Lena's father's old auto repair shop. He had bought it and, with a significant portion of his fortune, transformed it. It was no longer just a garage. The sign out front read, "The Clara Drummond Foundation, a new beginning." It was a center for at-risk youth, a place where they could learn a trade, whether mechanics, computer programming, or design, a safe haven that offered the tools to build a future. The name was a tribute to the sister he had lost, an acknowledgement of his past failure, and a promise for the future. Arthur was no longer the reclusive CEO who ran his empire from an ivory tower. He was there on the shop floor, shirt sleeves rolled up, a smudge of grease on his cheek. He didn't know much about engines, but he was learning. His true function, however, was that of a mentor. He listened to the young people's stories, offered advice, used his vast business experience to help them turn their passions into life plans. He found a purpose that filled him in a way the billions in his bank account never could. The most significant transformation, however, was right beside him. Lena, now officially his daughter, was the true soul of the place. Newly 7 years old, she moved through the shop with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She knew every tool, every engine sound. She was no longer the serious, frightened girl who had rescued him from an alley. Her eyes shone with the security of someone who had found a home, and her laughter often echoed amidst the clang of tools. That Saturday afternoon, the shop was bustling with activity. Arthur was leaning over the hood of the old clunker, the relic that had brought them together, which he had refused to discard. He was restoring it, piece by piece. No, Dad," Lena's playful voice said beside him. "The wrench is the other one. That one's too big." He looked at the tool in his hand and then at the one she was pointing to. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that now came often. "I'm still learning." "That's okay," she said, patting his arm. "You learn fast, for an old guy." He laughed, the sound filling the space. He was no longer the cold, pragmatic man who saw people as pieces on a chessboard. The logic was still there, but now it was tempered by empathy, by patience. The fear of helplessness, the wound that had haunted him for so long, had finally begun to heal. He realized that true strength didn't lie in absolute control or self-sufficiency, but in the ability to trust, to ask for help, to connect. His salvation didn't come from his power or his money, but from the act of selfless courage of a small stranger. Helena Vargas appeared at the shop door, holding a copy of her magazine. On the cover, a photo of Arthur and Lena, smiling, with the workshop in the background. The headline read, "The Billionaire Who Found His Fortune." She had become an unlikely friend, a regular visitor who documented the foundation's progress. "Nice photo," she said, handing the magazine to Arthur. He looked at the image. He saw a man he barely recognized, a man whose eyes no longer reflected the weight of the world, but the light of a purpose found, and beside him a radiant girl, the symbol of his redemption. Later, as the sun began to set and the workshop grew quiet, Arthur and Lena sat on the bumper of the old clunker. "Dad," Lena said thoughtfully, "do you miss being super rich?" Arthur thought for a moment, looking at her face, illuminated by the golden light of dusk. He remembered the loneliness of his penthouse, the emptiness of his days. He looked at his hands, calloused and a little dirty. "I've never been as rich as I am now," he replied, and it was the deepest truth he had ever spoken. The journey had been brutal, a relentless pursuit that had stripped him of everything he thought mattered. But in the end, he not only survived, he was reborn. He found a family in the most unexpected place and discovered that the greatest power is not what you accumulate, but what you share. And in that sanctuary of hope and second chances, the man who was once lost found his way back home.